The air in dusty Redemption Square stood still, thick with the August heat and the stench of silent complicity. The fifth lash was a serpent of fire, tearing a fresh, weeping line of crimson across Abigail's back. She choked on a scream that died in her throat, her body shuddering violently against the rough-hewn wood of the whipping post. Her father, the architect of this public degradation he called family justice, watched with a face of carved granite, his honor supposedly being cleansed with every drop of her blood. The crowd, a silent, watchful monolith, was a sea of familiar faces, men she'd known her whole life from church pews and the general store. They were her neighbors, her kin, and they were all letting it happen. But as the hired man, his face a mask of bored indifference, drew back his arm for the final soul-crushing blow, a shadow fell over him. It was long and sharp in the afternoon sun. A voice, calm as a dusk breeze but carrying the weight of granite, cut through the suffocating silence. "That's enough." Every head turned. He stood there, a man who seemed to have materialized from the heat haze itself. He was tall, lean, with eyes hidden under the brim of a dusty hat. He hadn't bought supplies, hadn't spoken a word since riding into town 2 days prior. He was just a watcher. Until now. He was no longer watching. Part 1. The Claim. The hired man, a brute named Cletus, whose knuckles were as thick as his skull, froze mid-swing. The leather whip, thirsty for a final taste of blood, hovered in the air. Sheriff Miller, a man whose spine was made of jelly and political ambition, blinked as if waking from a long, unpleasant dream. He hitched his pants, his badge glinting uselessly in the sun. "Now, hold on, stranger," Miller stammered, his hand hovering near the worn pistol on his hip, a gesture more of habit than of actual threat. "This is a town matter, a private, disciplinary action for a defiant woman." The stranger, Caleb Thorne, didn't spare the sheriff a glance. His attention was a physical force, pinning the whip wielder in place. He slowly looked up, and for the first time, the town saw his eyes. They were a startling, piercing blue, like chips of a winter sky, and they held no warmth at all. They held a chilling stillness. "I heard you," Caleb said, his voice dropping lower, each word a sharpened stone meant to wound. "Drop it." A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. This was an unwelcome disruption to the grim spectacle they had all tacitly agreed to witness. Men shifted their weight. Women pulled their shawls tighter, even in the heat. Caleb took a slow, deliberate step forward, the dust swirling around his worn boots. He moved with the lethal grace of a predator, and the space around him seemed to crackle with a dangerous, contained energy. He stopped directly between Abigail and the whip, a human shield of lean muscle and righteous fury. Abigail's father, a man named Josiah, who valued his pride above his own blood, finally found his voice. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" he bellowed from the edge of the square, his face purple with rage. "This is my daughter, my shame." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Caleb's face. Contempt. He finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, lingering for a blistering moment on Josiah's enraged face before settling back on the sheriff. "I've seen justice, Sheriff," he stated, his voice devoid of any doubt. "And I've seen cruelty dressed up in piety. You're standing on the wrong side of the line, and I think you know it." Then he did the unthinkable. He turned his back on the whip, on the sheriff, on the entire gawking town, and walked to Abigail. Her head was bowed, her blonde hair matted with sweat and dust, her strength finally failing. He ignored the sheriff's sputtering protests as he began working on the coarse ropes binding her wrists. The knots were slick with blood and sweat, pulled tight by a vindictive hand. "By what right?" Someone, emboldened by the anonymity of the crowd, shouted. Caleb didn't look up from his task. His fingers, though calloused, were surprisingly nimble. He worked at the knot with a focused intensity, as if nothing else in the world existed. "Not again," a voice screamed in his head. "You will not stand by and watch again." The image of another face, younger than this woman's, but with the same defiant spark, flashed behind his eyes. His sister, years ago. A memory of his own cowardice that tasted like ash. He pushed it down, focusing on the rope. He freed one of her hands, then the other. As Abigail's body slumped, no longer held up by the bindings, he caught her before she could hit the dirt. With a startling gentleness, he pulled her against his chest. Her blood immediately began to stain his dusty shirt, a warm, wet bloom of scarlet against the coarse fabric. He held her for a moment, feeling the fragile tremor of her breathing. He could feel every sharp edge of her vertebrae, the utter depletion of her strength. A protective rage, so potent it almost choked him, rose in his throat. He finally lifted his head, his face a mask of cold fury that made even her father take an involuntary step back. He looked directly at Josiah. "By the right of a husband," Caleb declared. His voice wasn't loud, but it rang with the clear, sharp finality of a death knell, echoing across the stunned square. A collective gasp sucked the air from redemption. Even Abigail, drifting in a black-edged haze of pain, stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, trying to focus on the face of the man holding her. Husband? The word was a foreign sound, a nonsense syllable in the language of her pain. "We were married by a traveling preacher 4 days ago, just over the county line," Caleb lied, his voice weaving a story so audacious, so detailed, it had to be true. He was building a fortress of words around her. "She came to me after fleeing this town, and the man you tried to sell her to. A man who put his hands on her. I brought her back for her belongings. I didn't know." His voice cracked with a sudden, raw emotion as he looked down at her broken form. "I didn't know you were savages who would publicly torture your own." The lie hung in the air, perfect and unbreakable. A married woman could not be punished for defying a prior betrothal. The entire legal and moral foundation of the whipping crumbled into dust. Sheriff Miller's face went pale. He was trapped between the fury of the town's most powerful family and the cold, deadly certainty of the stranger. He chose the path of least immediate resistance. Without another word, Caleb adjusted his grip and lifted Abigail fully into his arms. She felt weightless, a broken bird. As he turned and walked away, the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe. They just watched as the stranger carried his wife out of the town of redemption, his back straight and unyielding, leaving only their collective shame and a deafening silence in his wake. The journey out of town was a blur of motion and sensation for Abigail. The agonizing pain in her back was a constant, fiery presence, but overlying it was a strange, profound sense of security. Tucked against Caleb's chest, she could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her ear, a counterpoint to the thundering hooves of his horse. The wind was a cold balm on her feverish skin. Each jolt of the horse sent waves of fire across her back, but his arm around her was an iron-strong anchor in a sea of pain. She surrendered to the darkness, her last conscious thought being the impossible gentleness in the hands of this ferociously dangerous man. Part 2. The Sanctum of Scars. She awoke to the scent of pine, wood smoke, and brewing coffee. For a moment, she was adrift, unsure of where she was or what had happened. Then the pain returned, a dull, throbbing map of cruelty on her back, and memory came rushing in. She was lying on her stomach on a narrow but surprisingly soft cot. The rough, blood-caked fabric of her dress was gone. A cool, damp cloth was being pressed with infinite care against the burning lashes. "Easy now," a low voice murmured. "Just lie still." Her eyes fluttered open, The cabin was small, but it wasn't cramped. It was orderly, built with a woodsman's solid, honest skill. Every object had its place. A neat stack of books on a small table, a rifle gleaming on its pegs by the door, a row of pewter mugs hanging by the hearth. It was the home of a man who lived a life of deliberate solitude. It felt like a sanctuary. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Caleb was beside her, his back to the fire, his face illuminated by the warm light. The cold intensity she'd seen in the square was gone, replaced by a focused, almost tender concentration as he cleaned her wounds. He worked with a surgeon's precision, his large, calloused hands moving with a grace that seemed impossible. He had a basin of warm water and a stack of clean linen at his side. "You're not his property," he whispered, so low she wasn't sure if he meant for her to hear. He dipped the cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and gently dabbed at another raw stripe. "You're not a disgrace." He paused, his touch feather-light as he worked around the worst of the welts. "You are not a thing to be broken." Each word was a balm, more healing than the antiseptic herbs he'd steeped in the water. It was as if he were trying to wash away not just the blood, but the shame they had tried to brand on her very soul. A single tear escaped her eye, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear not of pain, but of some overwhelming, unnamed emotion. "Why?" she croaked, her voice a dry, dusty rasp. "Why did you do that?" He paused, his hand hovering over her back. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw past the hard, protective exterior. His piercing blue eyes held a deep, ancient sorrow, a pain that seemed to mirror her own in some fundamental way. He wasn't just a rescuer, he was a fellow survivor. "Because I know what it is to watch," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he clearly fought to control. "And I know the cost of doing nothing. I made that mistake once. I won't make it again." He said no more on the subject, simply returning to his task. But in that shared glance, a universe of understanding passed between them. They were two solitary souls, scarred by the world in different ways, who had just found a strange and powerful recognition in each other's eyes. As he finished cleaning the wounds, applying a soothing salve that smelled of comfrey and yarrow, a new feeling began to smolder in Abigail's chest. It was something fierce and wild that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. It was a dangerous, magnetic pull toward this man who had shielded her with his body and saved her with a lie. He helped her slip into a large, soft flannel shirt of his own, moving with an impersonal efficiency that she was somehow grateful for. The intimacy of the moment was already overwhelming. He settled her back on the cot, covering her with a thick wool blanket. "Rest," he said, his voice once again guarded. "You're safe here." He retreated to the other side of the cabin, busying himself with the fire, giving her space. But Abigail couldn't rest. Not yet. She lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of him moving about his home. The quiet scrape of a chair, the soft clink of a mug, the rustle of a page turning. Every sound was a reassurance. Every sound was a brick in the wall he was building around her, a wall to keep the world out. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something she had thought was lost to her forever. Hope. But it was tangled with a new, confusing, and powerful desire for the quiet stranger who was now her reluctant keeper. She drifted into an exhausted sleep, her dreams a chaotic mix of lashing whips and the impossible blue of Caleb Thorne's eyes. Part 3. The Language of Silence. The days that followed were measured not in hours, but in the slow return of strength and the deepening of a living silence. It was a silence filled with the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the wind through the pines, and the thousands of unspoken words that hung in the air between them. Caleb was a ghost in his own home, moving with a quiet purpose that Abigail found herself mesmerized by. He chopped wood with a powerful economic rhythm. He hunted for their food, returning silently with a rabbit or a grouse. He kept the water basin full and the fire fed, never intruding, never demanding. He left trays of food by her cot, a nourishing broth, a slice of smoke-cured meat, a piece of coarse but wholesome bread, and would then disappear outside, giving her the gift of solitude to heal. But she watched him. From the cocoon of her cot, she watched the play of muscles in his back and shoulders as he split logs, the sheer physical power held in careful check. She watched the way his hands, which could be so gentle with her wounds, could also expertly strip a rifle and clean it until it gleamed. She watched him at dusk, sitting on the small porch, staring out at the vast, lonely expanse of the wilderness that was his kingdom. His face in those moments was a mask of thoughts she couldn't begin to guess, his loneliness a palpable presence. He was a paradox, a man of profound stillness and sudden, decisive violence. And every part of him called to a part of her she thought had died at the whipping post, the part that was still wild, still unbroken. On the fifth day, a surge of desperate, frustrated energy propelled her. She had to stand. The pain was a white-hot scream as she pushed herself up, a small cry tearing from her lips before she could stifle it. In a heartbeat, he was there, bursting through the door from outside as if he had been listening for that very sound. "Easy," he said, his voice a low growl of concern. He knelt beside her, his large frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. "You'll tear the wounds open again. The healing's just started." "I can't just lie here," she said through gritted teeth, her body trembling with the sheer effort of sitting up. "I am not an invalid. I won't be." He didn't argue. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same defiance that had earned her the whipping, and he respected it. He simply offered his hand. She stared at it, strong, scarred, the hand that had untied her bonds. After a long moment, a moment where the entire world seemed to hold its breath, she placed her own in it. His grip was firm, warm, and sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity straight to her core. He helped her to her feet, his other hand finding her waist to steady her as she swayed. The casual, necessary contact was electric. Her skin burned where he touched her through the thin flannel of the shirt. She had to fight the sudden, dizzying urge to lean into him, to feel the solid strength of his body against hers, to let him hold her up. The air was thick with a tension that was more than just gratitude, more than just trust. It was a raw, untamed awareness of him as a man and her as a woman. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice unsteady for a reason that had nothing to do with pain. He just nodded, his piercing blue eyes holding hers for a fraction too long before he let go and stepped back, breaking the connection. That evening, she didn't retreat to the cot. She sat in the second chair by the fire, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He handed her a mug of strong, sweet tea, their fingers brushing as she took it. The accidental touch lingered, a brand of heat that she felt long after he had moved away. They sat without speaking, watching the flames dance and weave. It was a comfortable silence now, companionable. She found herself studying the lines of his face in the firelight, the hard set of his jaw, the faint white scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the profound loneliness that never quite left his eyes, even when he thought no one was looking. "You said, that day, you said you were my husband," she said softly, the words feeling heavy and momentous in the quiet room. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "It was the only thing I could think of that would stop them for good. A lie with the weight of law behind it." "But you're not," she stated, though it felt less like a fact and more like a question that hung, trembling, in the air. He held her gaze, his eyes searching hers for something she couldn't name. "No," he said slowly, his voice a low rumble. "Not unless you want me to be." The offer hung in the air between them, breathtaking in its honesty and its staggering implication. It wasn't a proposal born of romance, it was a choice. A power he was giving back to her, the very power that had been beaten out of her. He was offering her his name, his protection, his life as a shield, but only if she chose to pick it up. In that moment, the wild, smoldering feeling in her chest roared into a silent, brilliant flame. This man didn't want to own her. He wanted to arm her. And in that freedom, she felt a powerful, dangerous desire to bind herself to him forever. Part 4. The First Stand. Peace was a fragile, precious thing. It was the quiet mornings spent watching him work. It was the shared, silent meals that slowly became punctuated by small, hesitant conversations. It was the slow, steady mending of her skin and the even slower mending of her trust in the world. But the shadow of redemption and the men who ruled it was long and patient. It arrived a week later in the form of Sheriff Miller, his horse kicking up dust as he rode into the clearing, a reluctant emissary of evil. The timing was either perfect or terrible. Caleb was teaching Abigail how to aim a rifle, not a pistol, but his own heavy Winchester. "You need to know how to protect this place," he'd said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "To protect yourself." He stood close behind her, his body a warm, solid presence at her back. His arms came around hers to help her steady the heavy barrel. The proximity was intoxicating, overwhelming. His chest was pressed against her shoulders, and his breath stirred the fine hairs at her neck as he spoke in a low voice right by her ear. "Don't fight the weight. Become part of it. Breathe out and squeeze slow." Her heart was hammering, her senses filled with the scent of him, pine, leather, and something uniquely, masculinely Caleb. The sudden appearance of the sheriff shattered the intensely intimate moment. "Stay here," Caleb said, his voice instantly hardening as he took the rifle from her. He walked to the edge of the small porch, standing there like a sentinel. "Thorne," the sheriff called out, choosing to stay on his horse, maintaining a safe distance. "Just came to check on your wife. Word is, Josiah and Thompson aren't happy. Thompson feels he's been cheated out of his rightful property." Before Caleb could deliver the sharp reply that was forming on his lips, Abigail stepped onto the porch to stand beside him. Her back was straight, the pain a dull memory now compared to the fire of her indignation. The rifle Caleb had just given her was now held loosely but confidently in her own hands. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her. This was not the broken, weeping victim he had last seen. This was a woman standing her ground, her eyes burning with a cold, clear fire. "I am not, nor have I ever been, his property," Abigail said, her voice ringing out, strong and unwavering. "You stood by and watched while that man's hired hand beat me bloody, Sheriff. You have no authority here. This is our home. You are not welcome." Miller, a man used to bullying and bluster, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now listen, Missy." "Her name is Abigail," Caleb cut in, his voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "And she is right. This land is ours. The next time you or anyone else from that town rides onto it without an invitation, I will consider it a hostile act. Are we clear?" The threat was naked, unmistakable. Miller looked from Caleb's unyielding face to Abigail's defiant one. He saw the rifle in her hands and the one in his. He saw two people who would not be moved, who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. He saw a fight he couldn't possibly win. "Thompson's a powerful man," Miller muttered, a final, weak warning. "Josiah has the town council in his pocket. They won't let this go." "Let them come," Abigail said, the words tasting of iron and newfound freedom. As the sheriff retreated, turning his horse and riding away in a cloud of dust and humiliation, a powerful, unspoken current passed between Caleb and Abigail. He turned to her, and a slow, appreciative smile touched his lips for the very first time. It transformed his harsh features, erasing years of loneliness and pain, making him look younger, almost boyish. It struck her with the force of a physical blow. "You learn fast," he said, his voice soft with something that sounded like pride. "I have a good teacher," she replied, her heart hammering in her chest for a completely different reason now. He stepped closer into her space. The world narrowed to the few inches between them. He reached up, his hand coming to gently trace the line of her jaw. His touch was feather-light, a whisper of calloused skin against hers, yet it seared her. The wild love that had been growing in the quiet moments was no longer quiet. It was a roaring, beautiful fire, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be set free. He lowered his head, and she lifted hers, her eyes fluttering shut as she met him in a kiss. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was fierce and deep and hungry. It was a kiss of defiance, of survival, of two wild hearts claiming each other under the vast, unforgiving sky. It tasted of dust and tea and a desperate, shared loneliness. It was a promise, not of peace, but of a storm they would face together. When they finally broke apart, breathless, they knew that a line had been crossed. They had been two separate people fighting a common enemy. Now, they were one. Part 5. A storm of their own making. The kiss had changed everything. The silence between them was no longer one of healing and observation. It was now charged with a vibrant, humming energy. A shared glance across the cabin could set her skin tingling. The accidental brush of his hand as he passed her a plate could leave her breathless. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a new tenderness that was constantly threatening to spill over into the fierce passion they had discovered. They were a team, a unit, and the unspoken declaration on the porch had become a living, breathing thing between them. The storm they were waiting for broke 2 days later at sunset. Thompson arrived, but he was smarter this time. He didn't come with the spineless sheriff. He came with 2 hired guns, men with dead eyes and tied-down holsters who looked like they'd been scraped from the grimiest corners of the territory. They rode into the clearing slowly, deliberately, their arrogance a tangible thing that poisoned the evening air. Caleb and Abigail were on the porch, the memory of their kiss still a burning ember on their lips. They saw the riders and moved as one, a seamless, practiced unit forged in pain and fire. Caleb grabbed his rifle from its pegs, and Abigail picked up hers from where it leaned against the wall. Her hands were steady, her heart a cold, hard drum of resolve. "Abigail!" Thompson boomed, dismounting with a smug grin. He was a big man, fleshy and florid, dressed in clothes too fine for the dusty frontier. He looked at her as if she were a prize mare he had come to collect. "I've come to take you home. This foolishness has gone on long enough." "This is my home," Abigail replied, her voice ringing with a clarity and coldness that made Thompson's smile falter for a fraction of a second. "You belong to me. Your father made a deal," he snarled, his frustration showing. He took a heavy step forward. Caleb raised his rifle, the simple click of the hammer being pulled back, echoing loudly in the tense silence. "She belongs to no one," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying to the far edges of the clearing. "Take one more step, Thompson, and I'll bury you where you stand." Thompson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You and what army, rancher? It's 3 against the 2 of you." His men spread out, their hands hovering over their pistols. "You're wrong," Abigail said, and she took a step forward herself, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. She raised her own rifle, aiming it squarely at Thompson's chest. The weapon no longer felt heavy. It felt like an extension of her will. "It's 3 against us, and you have absolutely no idea who we are." The fire in her eyes, the raw, untamed power radiating from her, gave Thompson pause. He had come expecting a frightened, broken girl he could easily intimidate and drag back to redemption. He found a warrior. He looked from her defiant face to Caleb's, which was a mask of deadly calm, and for the first time, he understood his mistake. He wasn't facing 2 people. He was facing a single, unbreakable entity. He saw a love that was not soft and yielding, but a wild, dangerous force of nature. A love he could not comprehend, and therefore could not defeat. "This isn't over," he spat, his bravado crumbling into dust. His men looked at him, then at the 2 figures on the porch, and they too saw that the odds were not in their favor. "Oh, it is," Caleb said softly, a final, deadly promise in his voice. "You just don't know it yet. Ride out now, and you live to see another sunrise. Stay, and your story ends here, in this dirt." Something in Caleb's voice, a tone that spoke of graves dug and lines crossed, broke Thompson's nerve completely. He scrambled back onto his horse, yanking the reins with more force than necessary. He and his men turned and rode away, not with a swagger, but in a panicked, ignominious retreat. As the sound of their hoofbeats faded into the twilight, Abigail lowered her rifle, her body finally starting to tremble with the adrenaline crash. Caleb immediately put his arm around her, pulling her tight against his side, grounding her. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, breathing in his scent, feeling his strength flow into her. They had faced the storm and had not bent. They had become the storm. "He'll be back," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Or he'll send someone else." "I know," he said, his hand stroking her hair. "But we'll be here." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to frame his hard, beloved face. She looked into his eyes, seeing her own fierce, wild love reflected there. "I am not your wife by law, Caleb Thorne," she said, her voice thick with an emotion so powerful it was painful. "But I am your woman, in my heart, in my soul, from this day until my last. I am yours." He crushed his lips to hers then, a kiss that sealed their pact. It was a declaration of war against a world that had tried to break them, and a fervent promise of the life they would build together from the ashes. Part 6, Where New Things Grow. They didn't have to wait long for the next assault, but it came in a form they hadn't expected, not with guns, but with paper. Mayor Cartwell, the true, slithering power in redemption, sent a deputy with a notice. It was a deed, claiming Caleb's land was forfeit due to years of unpaid taxes, a blatant lie, but a legal, official one. They were being driven out not by force, but by the corrupt machinations of the law. It was a more insidious, more spirit-crushing attack. A grim despair settled over the cabin. As they began to pack their few belongings onto Caleb's horse, a small figure emerged from the tree line at the edge of the clearing. It was a young girl, no older than 12, her dress torn, her face smudged with dirt and tears. She had the same haunted, hunted look Abigail recognized in her own soul. A raw red rope burn was on her wrist. She was another runaway, another soul fleeing the justice of redemption. Abigail looked at the girl, her heart aching. Then she looked at Caleb. His face was grim, but his eyes were clear, his resolve hardening. Their fight had just ceased to be about their own survival. It was no longer just for them. They didn't run west. They turned back. They rode into redemption the next morning, not as victims fleeing, but as leaders returning to fight. They didn't go to the sheriff's office. They went to the square. With the girl, whose name was Sarah, standing between them, As living, breathing proof of the town's cruelty, Abigail stood on the steps of the general store, and she spoke. She didn't shout. Her voice was calm, clear, and carried in the morning air. She told her story. She told of the whipping, of her father's pride, of Caleb's courage, of Thompson's vile entitlement, and of Mayor Cartwell's deep-seated corruption that allowed it all to happen. Caleb stood beside her, his rifle held loosely in his hand, a silent, powerful testament to her every word. He was her guardian, her proof, her partner. The town, which had once been a monolith of silent complicity, began to fracture. The whispers of doubt that had started the day Caleb walked her out of the square now turned into murmurs of anger. Murmurs turned into shouts. Men who had stood by and watched now looked at their own daughters. Women who had been silent now felt a stirring of rebellion. The sight of the little girl, Sarah, with the rope burn on her wrist, broke the spell of fear that Cartwell and Josiah had held over them for so long. They had watched one woman be beaten. They would not stand by and watch a child be returned to her tormentors. The final confrontation happened right there, in the square, on the same ground where Abigail had bled. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a reckoning. Faced with the unified anger of the very people he had lorded over, Cartwell's power evaporated. He and a disgraced Thompson left town that night, their shadows swallowed by the darkness. Abigail and Caleb returned to the cabin, the deed to the land, now rightfully theirs, and signed by a new, humbled town council, tucked safely in Caleb's saddlebag. The cabin was no longer just a sanctuary for two wounded souls. It was the start of something new. A home. With Sarah, who slowly began to find her voice again in the safety of their care, they began to build a real life. One evening, months later, as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of fire and rose, Abigail stood with Caleb on the porch. They watched Sarah, now laughing and chattering, chase fireflies in the growing meadow. The sound of her joy was the most beautiful music Abigail had ever heard. "You never told me why you really stopped for me that day," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The real reason." Caleb was silent for a long moment, watching the girl he now thought of as a daughter. "I had a sister," he said, his voice thick with unshed grief. "Her name was Elodie. She was spirited. She had a fire in her, just like you. My father, he was a hard man. He tried to break her. I was young, just a boy. I stood by and watched him do it. I let it happen. One night, she ran away, and we never saw her again. For 20 years, I've lived with the ghost of my own cowardice." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes filled with a raw, vulnerable pain. "When I saw you in that square, Abigail, I wasn't just seeing you, I was seeing her. And God, in his own cruel and mysterious way, had given me a second chance, a chance to do the right thing." Tears streamed down Abigail's face as she listened. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding him tight. Their love wasn't just a wild, passionate fire. It was built on the ashes of their pasts, a testament to healing, forgiveness, and redemption. It was a love strong enough to build a new world, not just for them, but for any lost soul who might wander out of the darkness, looking for the light of a home. In the untamed West, stories are often written in blood and dust. But the truest legends are not about the gunfights or the gold. They are about the quiet moments of courage that change the world. The story of Caleb and Abigail is a testament to the fact that true strength isn't the power to dominate, but the courage to shield. True justice isn't found in a sheriff's decree, but in the unwavering conviction of a righteous heart. Their love, born in violence and forged in defiance, became a sanctuary, a wild, beautiful, and unbreakable thing. It reminds us that even in the harshest wilderness, the most beautiful things can grow. and that one person's refusal to stand by in silence can be the spark that ignites a revolution of the soul. They didn't just survive the West, they redeemed it. We hope you were inspired by this tale. If you believe in the power of courage and second chances, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs a story of true heart.